The purpose of today's hearing is to consider the future of school choice and opportunity scholarships in Pennsylvania. In anticipation of a new session of the legislature in January and a new administration in the governor's office, I scheduled this hearing to begin the public conversation and debate on school choice, specifically providing opportunity scholarships or vouchers to families so that they may choose the school that best meets the needs of their children. My goal is to have a civil debate. All sides will have an opportunity to be heard, and today's agenda reflects that.
3 states have passed failing school voucher programs since 1999: Florida, Louisiana, and Ohio. Of those states, empirical studies conducted in both Florida and Ohio have shown that public schools responded to the threat of vouchers. And one study found that the removal of the voucher threat significantly reduced the pace of improvement in Florida public schools. I urge you to listen to both sides carefully when forming your opinion on the issue.
I was in public schools. I started out in Roberto Clemente. When I was in Roberto, I was bullied constantly to the point where I thought of committing suicide. And the bullying didn't stop because they didn't take enough measures to make the kids or ask the kids to stop. I was offered a scholarship to go there for the last years of school, and my grandmom took it, and I wound up graduating from St. Malachi's, and I'm grateful that I went to a Catholic school because there the bullying wasn't like it was in public school. I didn't have thoughts of suicide. I didn't feel like I didn't want to be here. I was loved by all my classmates, and I loved my teachers. And I was learning more in St. Malachi's than I did at Roberto because in
9th grade. And it wasn't my choice of school. My 8th grade counselor suggested that school to me because due to latenesses, I actually didn't get into any high school that I wanted to get into. I didn't feel comfortable in Bach because it was just a big school and I didn't feel like I was important. So I left that school and I went to West Philadelphia High School for my 10th grade year. And my pastor at my church said, you know, Tanisha, there's a school that would fit you just perfectly. So I said, you know, what's the name? He was like City Center Academy. He said, why don't you apply while you're in West and see if you get in? My first year in West, I was very shocked with just how the kids were acting. They were just running in and out of the halls, yelling and screaming at their teachers and jumping on tables. So I knew that I didn't want to stay in there. I got into CCA, and my first 3 months were okay. As far as financial situations, my mom was struggling a lot. First, she cut off the cable, the internet, the telephone because she felt like it wasn't really important. But when winter came, my mom had to turn off, she couldn't pay for oil for the house to be warm. And I remember for like a week and a half, she couldn't pay for the water to be turned on because of my tuition. I applied for a scholarship at my school, and I got it. And that comes along with financial aid, and I'm just so thankful because I really like CCA, and it's a different experience than public school because you actually get along with the teachers, you get along with the students, and you actually grow relationships with the faculty. If this bill is passed, you will definitely help families like mine out and not allow us to sacrifice.
The testimony of the Pennsylvania School Boards Association that was just submitted for the record, and here's what they say. First and foremost, there is no evidence that suggests that students utilizing vouchers make any better progress in private or parochial schools than they did before transferring. Studies conducted in Milwaukee, Cleveland, and Washington, D.C. have reached the same conclusion. Yes, I take it you would take issue with that statement.
I think they're not reading the same studies. The fact is the studies they're quoting show positive participant effects for children, particularly children who are of color and particularly children who are poor. And Dr. Green just did a study, and I think this is really important. You want outcomes? The study that Dr. Green just did in Milwaukee found that students who receive a voucher are 12 times more likely to graduate than children who don't receive a voucher. Okay. I mean, that's a huge outcome.
However, I urge you to consider the impact that school choice as a solution will have on the overall public education system and on the democratic theory that our government holds the responsibility for educating all children, even those children who undoubtedly will not be chosen.
That you raised the very questions that we have to ask, and we appreciate it. We want to hear both sides of this issue. We just want to provide some choice, just like you had as a mom.
Those who used that information actually extracted certain components and didn't represent fairly the conclusions of the people who actually did the studies. And the next series of people who are going to be asked to testify are the people who actually did the studies. Their conclusion is dramatically different than your summary. That is, in fact, they believe that statistically, especially in urban communities that have disproportionate people who are poor and rural communities who are poor or people of color, in fact, have a considerable impact by the existence of vouchers. Are you aware of that?
I'm not, but I am aware of RFA's reputation, and nationwide they're actually considered a very reputable research firm. I have not done the research myself, so all I can do is look towards the organizations that do that type of research and have the record that you know, that generally what they put out is accurate. I'm not going to say I've read every study, and I know some studies do contradict themselves, but RFA is a very reputable research firm.
No, what I'm saying is the studies you cited, the people who wrote them, their conclusions are different.
Okay, and I know they looked at a number of studies, actually. It's a summary of a number of studies that they did.
I'm just talking about the ones you talked about in your testimony, that in fact the people who authored those studies, created the studies, have a different opinion in terms of summary as it relates to poor people and people of color.
Okay. I mean, that's fine. I'm sure there are always studies that are contradictory. I accept that.
So while we all evolve to that wonderful standard that hopefully one day we will get as a nation, and that is, one, we'll be colorblind, none of us will be hungry, there'll be no poverty, and all schools will be great. Until such time, those of us who are legislating this process will try to figure out how we even the playing field, and it may be a voucher.
Again, the concern with school choice is that it will not help every school improve, and that's why I'm here today. I said if a failing school student can get a taxpayer-funded scholarship to a private school, shouldn't the private school have to demonstrate through standardized test scores that that school isn't failing? And isn't it more logical that the students be given who get the scholarships be among those who are scoring at basic or below? Because if you take all the kids who are performing out of the school, what do you expect? You're taking the kids who you hope will affect their peers and encourage them to learn. You're taking the parents who care enough about their kids to try and do something for them, and you're taking them out of those buildings.
You assert that private schools have zero accountability. I don't agree with that. Parents who pay the tuition to send their kids there are going to hold those schools accountable for the education of their kids.
I guess it depends on how you look at the money. If the money is public money, then shouldn't the public be able to see both the financial and the performance results that money is producing?
I talked about sending more money. I've done that. I've talked about raising taxes. I've done that. I talked about teacher development. I talked about that. I talked about the whole. I talked about charter schools. I talked about the current system. I talked about reforms, some of which you've cited in there, plus tenfold more. So people who talk about reforming the system, even though I'm talking about a voucher today, frankly, it is a very small percentage of students who will be qualified to get a voucher, and it doesn't affect fixing the system or schools or all the students, because not so much that they won't apply, but a voucher doesn't apply in every circumstance to improve the quality of the school that the child's in. So I want to make sure you understand those of us who are engaged in this conversation do look beyond just the limitations of talking about vouchers.
Okay.
Teacher support, best practices. I've been screaming about this ever since I got interested in this issue. Of course best practices should be applied. There's a lot of impediments. PSCA is part of it, and some of the unions are part of why they don't have a place of best practices. Why don't you have a place of best practice? Because you have to measure teachers. Why don't we want to measure teachers? Because we give them all the same amount of money. So, for as much as people say they want these things, that's why you can't say yes or no directly. And my analogy about the burning house should be couched in this. The house is on fire. Phone call's been made to the fire company. There's 3 people in the house. It's not about you and I rescuing them. They're sitting in the house, they know it's burning.
Yeah.
Survival is to do one thing, run from it. Are they supposed to wait till the fire company comes and says, don't go down this stair, go down that stair? No, they're supposed to do what they're supposed to do. So for me, the analogy I should have made, and hopefully is captured, is the person who's in the burning building should have an option to get out of the burning building.
I appreciate your leadership, and it is very timely, your leadership on this important issue. I would encourage you and all others who come before you to engage in discussion, to not fall into the trap of thinking that the discussion about choice is either just about for or against vouchers for non-public schools. There is a much broader policy menu from which to select. There's a much broader policy agenda that this legislature, this state government, has supported to some degree for quite a few years. There are questions about the capacity even to continue to sustain financially those public school choices and support for private school choices that we've had on the books in some instances for 30 or 40 years, even as you give consideration to a new program that inevitably would cost some additional dollars. But it is very timely, as this committee demonstrates with this hearing, to begin to identify some of the significant policy questions that will need to be considered once there are specific proposals ready for action. And today I'd just like to share with the committee some of the key questions from our perspective. One, do the provisions of any specific proposal to come before the legislature comply with the provisions of the state constitution? Secondly, who will benefit financially from the availability of such a school voucher? Will the availability of the voucher dollars reduce the financial burden on parents paying tuition, or reduce the burden on school sponsors who sometimes subsidize tuition and other costs, or benefit employees by making available more funding for improved salaries and benefits? While a dollar may be split 3 ways, each of these 3 beneficiaries cannot receive the entire dollar. The legislation should be clear in its intent, and the legislation should be clear about how that intention shall be enforced. Third question, will the size of the voucher vary among students depending on tuition costs, the financial need of the student's family, or some other consideration? Or will all vouchers be equal? Will the legislation address or ignore issues of financial need and actual costs? 4, assuming for the moment that tuition does not substantially increase, will the dollar value of the voucher in proposed legislation be sufficient to actually enable a significant number of additional students to be able to afford the current tuition and costs of attending a non-public school? 5th, what are the legislation's intended benefits in terms of access to enrollment options in the non-public sector? Will any student beyond the number currently enrolled have real opportunities to choose non-public enrollment? Will the capacity of non-public schools increase to accommodate any significant number of new students, not just in any single district, but across the state? Questions 3, 4, and 5 are important in helping to determine whether any proposed legislation will actually make a difference for students currently enrolled in public schools or homeschooled, or whether the proposed legislation will largely result in payment from the Commonwealth to or for students already taking advantage of non-public school options. 6, how will the legislation assure that students with special needs and IEPs and students who are English language learners have equal access with all other students to positions in non-public schools where they might use a voucher? 7, will the new expenditure of state funding have any impact on student achievement and preparation of workforce and citizenry for the Commonwealth, and how will this be measured? 8, what form of accountability, if any, should accompany the voucher? 9, what will be the additional cost to state taxpayers, short-term and long-term, for a proposed voucher program? 10, will the new expense of a voucher program diminish the state's willingness and or capacity to correct serious problems with underfunding and unfair funding of public schools?